Thank you for coming to learn about our Internet Security Report, which we do every quarter. Before we jump right in, I think it's a good chance to introduce ourselves. My name's Corey Nachreiner. I'm the Chief Security Officer or Chief Information Security Officer, whichever you prefer at WatchGuard Technologies. I've been here for quite a long time, an anomaly in the tech industry. Before this, I was the Chief Technology Officer, and I still share some of those duties even in my new role, and have had all kinds of roles before at WatchGuard. Kind of a security nerd like the rest of my team. Although, as Marc would tell you, I've gone to the dark side of management and I'm losing on all my skills. But with that, I'll hand it over to Marc to introduce himself.
Speaking of losing all their skills, hey everyone, and good to see the folks that have come around for another one of these. For those that this is their first of our Internet Security Report webinars. I'm Marc Laliberte. I help run our security operations team as well as our threat research team, what we call the WatchGuard Threat Lab, which is where the bulk of this information in today's webinar will come from. So this webinar is on the topic of our security report that just came out, I think about a week or so ago, for Q4 of 2023. It was not just Corey and I that wrote it. In fact, we did only a small part of it. It's largely thanks to the help of our team of co-authors that help sift through the data that we get from customers that have opted into sharing it with us, and turn out this actionable intelligence for all of you. So hats off to our co-authors yet again for another great report.
Yeah, for sure. With that, let's just talk about what we're covering today very quickly and get right down to it so we can share the actual data. So the way our report is kind of, excuse my mic bump, is laid out is it starts with our network-based intelligence that we call the Firebox feed. Some of you listening may be Firebox customers or partners, and as you know, your Firebox, depending on the type of licensing you have, beyond just being a very strong next-generation firewall or unified threat management device, it has a lot of other network-based security services, many different anti-malware services and stuff like that. So the Firebox feed, which Marc will talk about in more detail, covers those trends. But of course, we have our endpoint products, WatchGuard EPDR, and which comes from a company acquisition and previous product, Panda Adaptive Defense 360, which is a very strong enterprise endpoint detection and response and full endpoint protection platform. And we also take an endpoint view of the data by that product. And by the way, we really like combining the network view with the endpoint view because both sides actually see different stuff. The stuff you defend and catch at your network is sometimes quite different than the payloads that end up making it down to endpoints, especially because malware nowadays is staged. So unless it starts executing on the endpoint, you won't really see the final payloads. But really, the point of this isn't just to highlight the threats that we see attackers trying against these different security products, but it's to talk about protection too. The only real reason us as security professionals should be following the threat trends aren't to sensationalize what the hackers are doing, but it's more to learn from them. If we can see what they do most often, we can make sure that we have the right protections to go with those risks. With that said, let's jump straight into the network section, which starts with the Firebox feed. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to Marc to describe that in a little more detail.
Yeah, and as we go through this, by the way, Liz mentioned you can submit questions through the Q&A widget within GoToWebinar here. Corey and I have it open, and we will try and answer questions as we go through real time. But if we're not able to get to something, we'll try and get to it at the end of the webinar. So please ask away. So for those that aren't familiar with the Firebox feed, it's the name we give this threat intelligence source that's made up of tens of thousands of Firebox appliances around the world where the administrator has opted into sharing that intelligence with us. If you admin your own Firebox, which I'm willing to bet a large portion of our listeners on this webinar do, under the general settings of that device, there's a checkbox that says send device feedback to WatchGuard. That sends some telemetry for just service usage in there to help our product team decide what to stick on the roadmap for improvements or additions to the device. But it also sends us threat intelligence anytime one of the many layers of security services on the device detects and blocks a threat on it. Those layers specifically that we're looking at are the three layers of anti-malware. So gateway antivirus, which is a legacy signature-based anti-malware engine that does a really good job of quickly catching known threats. But as we've discussed in previous webinars and just about every report we've ever put out, it alone isn't enough to catch all of the evasive and what we call zero-day malware threats that are out there. To back that up, we have two other layers of anti-malware. So intelligent AV, which is, I don't know if we're allowed to call it machine learning anymore, Corey. I think we have to call it artificial intelligence. But
So we're officially giving up to marketing buzzwords then. Intelligent, it's
yes,
multimodal and it can just act like us now. It doesn't just do one thing good. I guess
exactly. Hey
so.
Siri, predict malware for me. So as we're joking about though, IAV uses a machine learning model or AI because this is a PowerPoint presentation to try and predict whether something's going to be good or bad based off of the training that it's been built on. And then behind that, we've got APT blocker, which is our behavioral detection engine, where we'll actually submit a file to a cloud-based sandbox and detonate it and then watch its behaviors so that we can catch that malware before it's able to do any threats on your actual endpoint. Beyond malware detection, we've got our intrusion protection service or IPS engine that looks for exploits of vulnerabilities in not just web applications, but even just web connected clients as well. We commonly see things like vulnerable web browsers that go to a honeypot or a watering hole website, where an attacker will try and exploit a client-side vulnerability in it as well too. And then finally, we've got DNS Watch, which is a DNS firewalling based service where we can actually identify and block connections primarily to phishing destinations, but as you'll see, other malicious destinations as well before that network resolution or the name resolution even occurs for the connection.
Oh, sorry, Mark. Give me 2 seconds.
No
I
problem.
have
I just
lost
learned how to use
window
PowerPoint today as
focus.
well.
Oh, shush.
This report or this section's, we're going to start by going over the malware detections that we saw from the quarter. And we'd like to start at the 20,000 foot level of just high level, what are the key trends in malware overall? And one of the big trends from this quarter was malware volume was up and up quite substantially for evasive malware specifically. So one of the numbers we track is on average, how many malware payloads does the typical firebox around the world detect and block at the network perimeter? And we found in the quarter that every single firebox out there on average blocked around 2,400 malware threats over the course of the quarter, which is a pretty high volume. And part of this was fueled by increases both in our intelligent AV engine detections and APT blocker detection engines as well, with a nearly 200% increase quarter over quarter for intelligent AV and a 36% increase in volume for APT blocker. This is also paired with a slight increase in detections from the signature based anti malware service, which on its own typically has a high volume in general because it does a great job of catching those known threats. But overall, malware detections were up. And Corey, I think you had something else you wanted to add to?
Yeah, I was going to add a little bit of color. I can't remember the exact timing, but I think it was 3 quarters ago where rather than just giving you a big raw number, we moved to this per firebox number. Like in the past, we would report of the devices reporting in, there were 20 million malware samples that were blocked. And that's a big number. It's interesting, but it doesn't really put it into context of use. So that's why we've changed these new numbers. So if you are a individual Firebox owner, or if you own multiple Fireboxes, you can kind of use this to see how much you could be blocking every quarter. As you can see, almost 2,500 per Firebox. But I also do think it's interesting to extrapolate that number. So in our quarterly report, we have one place we extrapolate it where we take all the devices reporting in. Not all of them are running security services, but we extrapolate if they were, what that number would be. But for this call, I went one extra where I actually using some of our cloud data that just basically lets us know the people out there with active fireboxes. Uh, this really equates to over the quarter WatchGuard fireboxes, at least the ones active. There's probably twice as many out there that don't have active licenses. We saw at 933,617,296 malware detections. So the number might look, relatively small, although very big per single owner. But if you put that across all the fireboxes, malware is very active. Almost a billion different malware samples being catched. Not a million different samples, but a million malware detections happening across all our firewalls. So it's very interesting for sure. But to continue with the high level stuff, another thing we track, and this should say 0-day malware. You see that in the figure number. I want to be very specific. Marc kind of talked about this, but a lot of times in the security industry, because really the original meaning of 0-day was more around an exploit, a software vulnerability. This is not that type of 0-day. For a 0-day software vulnerability, by the way, it means a software vulnerability that has not been patched. So the second you know about it, it's a 0-day and you can exploit it. The reason we made up this term called 0-day malware is that's kind of true with malware. Our gateway antivirus service, we call it legacy. That doesn't mean it's not new and good. It's very good at using patterns to catch malware. But using patterns to catch malware in itself is kind of a legacy idea, because by definition, if you have to wait to see the malware when the malware comes out on that 0-day to actually figure out a pattern to catch it, you're already behind the game, because sometimes it may be hours, but worse, according to some studies by a company called Lastline, it could be days or weeks before a security analyst sees that malware, creates a pattern for it, and for those hours, days, or weeks, the malware is being spread without signature-based detection catching it. So really, a long way of me saying when we're talking about 0-day malware, we mean that malware that signature-based protection doesn't catch. And the cool thing, as Marc laid out about our different malware services, is we can get a good idea of this number, because intelligent AV, the, according to Marc, AI-based, it's machine learning, malware detection is very proactive. It doesn't need a signature. And same with APT blocker. APT blocker is behavioral based. So those detections happen after the signature based detection. So simply by comparing what those two more proactive ways catch, what kind of malware they catch, we get a good idea of how our signatures, how much signatures are behind. And while we're specifically comparing our products, I think it's safe to say I think any signature-based AV out there would be similar to this compared to any sort of anti-malware that use the similar proactive techniques that we use. But at the end of the day, what you're seeing here is 60% of the malware our fireboxes were detecting, of that potentially almost a billion samples during the quarter, was 0-day. That means if you're a person that only had basic security, you're only using the gateway antivirus or signature-based malware, you're only catching that 40% of it you see there. You're missing quite a bit. And it really illustrates the importance of using the more proactive services, which are, again, intelligent AV and APT blocker. The other chart you see here is 0-day malware with TLS. As the nerds that remember all the acronyms know, TLS is basically a type of encryption. You shouldn't be using SSL anymore because all SSL variants are kind of out of date and depreciated, but TLS is the new one. So what that means is when you're going to websites, 95% of the time or more, they're encrypted, and they're encrypted with TLS. Nowadays, a lot of malware sneaks past protections because people are not enabling TLS decryption. It's a free and cool feature of our Firebox. And we find that often most malware we see even more malware in general going over TLS. So as you can see, there was a little bit more 0-day TLS based 0-day malware at 61%. This was actually a drop though. Total 0-day malware, that 60%, that was up quarter over quarter. but the 0 day with TLS is actually usually significantly higher than non-TLS 0 day. This actually dropped about 10% compared to last quarter. Nonetheless, whether you're looking at over encrypted traffic or normal, 60%, more than half the malware being missed without advanced protection is a pretty big deal. So it's just a good thing to know. Uh, it is still good to keep signature based malware around or anti malware around because it is very good at quickly catching the obvious. A lot of malware is that noisy, obvious stuff. And signature based detection will always be very fast at that. But definitely use the other services as well because you'll miss a lot without them.
So one of the
So,
things that we
Marc,
also track every quarter are different views of the top malware we're seeing, both by volume and by the number of impacted devices. One of the things we've been able to do with this list recently is historically this list has been based off of our gateway antivirus engine, where when we get a detection, we know exactly which signature triggered it, and generally we can extrapolate that pretty easily out to the family. With our other evasive anti-malware engines, like Intelligent AV or APT Blocker, they don't generally map to a specific like variant or signature. Intelligent AV just says, yes, this is bad, past a certain threshold of badness. And APT Blocker says, yes, this is bad because it does X, Y, and Z, but they don't say, oh, this is, Agent Tesla on the device. So what we've started doing is taking the MD5 hash of the files that we get, because we do at least get to see the MD5, the signature of these files, and then using open source threat intelligence tools to map that back to a family or a signature so that they can be represented in these top malware lists as well too. So with that said, the top malware list for quarter four of 2023 has no brand new additions to it when compared to previous quarters. Normally we have like one or two new malware families squeaking in, but this quarter was all returnees from previous quarters. But there's still a
by
few
the
interesting
way,
things in here. Oh, go ahead.
This gets a little nerdy, but if I can pause there, based on what you said, basically Mark has just mentioned this list used to be just a GAV, but now it's GAV and intelligent AV because of that mapping Mark talked about. What I found a little interesting is remember, based on my 0 day spiel, IAV is catching things that GAV missed. And yet, when you look at the families in this top 10, Mark just told you they didn't change. So that means GAV is missing stuff that's the same, you would think. So why is that? I think it's actually important to talk about, and it's because of variance. When you look at a malware family, you have to remember one of the easiest ways that bad guys evade signature based detection is just by creating polymorphic malware, using cryptors or signers where it is the same threat. It might be that, how would you pronounce that, Mark? Zord DDoS or Zord DDoS? It might be that real dropper that really is a DDoS tool or whatever. But these packers and cryptors will take it on a binary level, change it enough that the signature changes, and that's what simply gets them past some of the signatures. So anyways, if you were wondering, hey, if you added IAV, why aren't you seeing new families here? The reason is it's probably just polymorphic. It's probably just bad guys recrypting the normal stuff that is the most popular, but it illustrates the value of that to bad guys. These packers and cryptors, really, some of them have their malware distribution servers. Every time there's a new victim, they automatically repack it every time, so it looks binarily different to every victim, which means just another reason why signature-based malware is still good for the noise, but it's not enough. Sorry about that digression, Mark.
Yeah, how dare you? So when we look through the specific variants in this list, two of the top ones, that Zor DDoS one that Corey just mentioned and the Linux Lucifer one, were actually ones we first detected last quarter, so in quarter three of 2023. If you're not familiar with them, so the very top one was, like Corey suggested, it's actually an SSH brute forcer slash botnet that targets Linux servers with SSH remote access exposed to the internet. It'll try and brute force its way in using different credential-based attacks. Once it gains access, it'll gain persistence and then use that host to try and go after other ones on the internet and spread out this botnet. That Linux Lucifer variant down below it, is a crypto miner that we saw really explode in quarter 3 of 2023, and still remains a top detected variant from this last quarter. A few other interesting ones. So there's Logan.584 around the middle of here, which is a password stealer that installs itself using Office exploits. So it typically arrives over a phishing message with a malicious Office attachment. And if your users have not kept their Microsoft Office up to date, even opening that attachment can be enough to trigger the potential exploit within it. And last one I'll highlight, js.agent.uuq towards the bottom, is a JavaScript-based malware variant that is pretty interesting. So it looks at your web traffic and where your web browser is trying to go to, and it looks for keywords associated with cryptocurrency exchanges like Binance or Huobi or OKX. And it will, if it sees that, proxy your traffic to a server under the attacker's control, supposedly so that that attacker can then potentially modify your activity within that exchange or steal your credentials and ultimately drain your cryptocurrency wallet if you are a user of one of these exchanges. Beyond the top
Uh,
10, Corey? Oh, go ahead.
Before we stop to that, I just wanted to, because I always want to shout out the report. As Liz mentioned, you can actually get the Internet Security Report, the full PDF, in this GoToMeeting webinar if you go to materials. But do know we're skipping past a lot of other interesting charts that we show in the malware section. For instance, we have the top 5 encrypted malware detections, which I think we might add to the next webinar. One of my feelings is really that the encrypted malware detections is probably a more realistic view of what's really the top threats. And the reason I say that is because 95 to 99% of the sites you go to online are encrypted, and most malware is coming over encrypted connections. Our problem is only around 20% of Firebox users decrypted. So we still show the unencrypted. That top malware includes both encrypted and non-encrypted samples, but a lot of it is the unencrypted stuff. Whereas if you look at our top 5 encrypted stuff, that is what we're seeing in encrypted traffic, and it's probably more popular than the unencrypted malware. So I'd check that out. And we also have interesting things like widespread detections. Like this top 10 list is based just on raw volume, but it could just be a couple fireboxes in one region that just get a lot of volume of one particular threat. Whereas if you start looking at the widespread malware detections, by that we mean the malware that's hitting many, many different fireboxes, the most fireboxes. So just wanted to add that shout out, Mark, so people know that there's a lot of additional detail you should check out in the report.
Yeah. And there's also we go into a deep dive into a few specific malware variants throughout the report. I won't get into all of them here, but there's 3 notable ones that I wanted to chat about. The first one, the signature is called JS Agent USF. But really, this is another JavaScript-based dropper that will try and trick the victim into visiting a website under an attacker's control and then download and try and execute malware from that site. And specifically, it's delivering something called Darkgate, which is a malware variant that we've seen both at the network perimeter and at the endpoint as well too. If you're not familiar with Darkgate, it's itself a malware loader as well. It's commonly used to gain like a beachhead on infected systems that the attacker can then turn around and sell that access on a underground marketplace. If you're not familiar with how these malicious hackers leverage underground marketplaces these days, just about every single stage of the malware delivery and execution pipeline is entirely commoditized now. If you have a ransomware variant that you want to deploy, you can go purchase access to compromised machines to deploy it to. If you need help getting that ransomware variant, you can purchase a ransomware as a service offering and have someone else code it for you. Everything out there now, you don't need any skill to launch a cyber attack. You can go just purchase little pieces along the cyber kill chain to get you there. And Darkgate is one of those variants that can end up with machines that are put up for sale as a compromised laptop that you can go and install your malware variant on. Another interesting variant from the quarter was this pdf.spam.hero1 signature. This one is a heuristic-based signature, so it's not looking for something specific. It's looking for something just is generally suspicious. And it caught a lot of PDF files that link to malicious websites. And these websites can host many different malware families, but we saw them commonly containing credential stealers as well. One example of these, the PDF email, when you open it up, it's got a fake like CAPTCHA prompt in there saying with a link that says, "I'm not a robot." When you click that link, it takes you to a website that will ultimately try and trick you into giving up credentials or payment card information. Another example would trick you to visiting a web forum that had a registration form where you had to pay a membership activation by putting in your credit card info. Can't imagine, like, I hate to imagine the type of person that would fall for that. And hopefully they get some security training at some point too. Um,
And the report includes some screenshots of those. I mean, by now, a lot of you have probably seen some of these phishing sites, but I think it's always good to familiarize yourself with the screenshots.
yep.
Obviously, if you're just going to a random link, you shouldn't make a payment, but it helps to look at the screenshots to see what you might look out for these type of phishing pages.
And the last one we'll briefly chat about is this Trojan Zmutzi signature, which is another loader in this case that typically delivers other malware. We try and go out, so the firebox is detecting the loader, this first stage of the malware attack. We'll go out and check to see exactly what that loader was trying to download ultimately onto the endpoint. And in this case, we saw it primarily downloading the Agent Tesla remote access Trojan. These typically arrived over phishing emails again. Some of our examples we saw had tons of grammar mistakes in the email body itself that, if you're paying attention and have learned good phishing awareness training practices, you would have spotted this pretty easily. But if you didn't, you may have been tricked into opening the zip archive attachment that had literally an executable file in it that was pretending to be a PDF, which is a pretty common delivery method, although very basic delivery method that hopefully most endpoint anti-malware engines would catch too.
And people, man, if you read this email, like one line is refer to attached document for payment, SWIFT, and corresponding invoice. I mean, it's obvious, and the refer had two F's. So hopefully humans wouldn't fall for these, but tools like ours would catch them for sure.
Yeah, I'm terrible at spelling, but even I would understand some of
That's
those
true.
grammar mistakes. Hey,
Actually, maybe I was going to say I actually am the typo king, so you might be trained to fall for phishing because you have to deal with my typos, so you've gotten used to all my emails, or at least my text messages. I tend to edit emails more.
exactly.
Anyways, jokes aside, moving on to we also have our network section where we talk about network attacks. As I think Mark highlighted in Firebox feed, these are primarily driven by our intrusion prevention system. So network attacks are basically software vulnerabilities in network attacked applications. Remember, a lot of us immediately think servers, things like I have web servers like IIS, an SSH server, an RDP server, but they can also be client-based vulnerabilities too. So it could be something in a browser that's triggered by you going to visit a site as well. So going back to the per firebox numbers, I didn't do the calculation for this. I can maybe do it when I move it over to Mark, but on average, IPS had 87 different exploits it detected during Q4 per firebox. Seems like small, but remember this is per firebox. So the average firebox during a 3-month period, you would have attackers trying 87 different software exploits against either your clients going to visit things or maybe a server you've exposed on the internet. Like everywhere else in the report, you'll find our top IPS, you'll find a top 10 list purely by volume. But in this case, we decided to show you our most widespread network attacks. We didn't show you widespread malware, but like what I was describing for malware, this isn't the most common attacks by pure volume. Instead, this is the most common attacks that hit the most number of fireboxes around the world. And you can see, and this is true for the malware part in our report too, that when we do the widespread network attacks, we also will regionalize it. We'll both tell you what different regions of the world, whether it's the Americas, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, or the Asia Pacific, which region was most affected, and we'll give you some of the top countries affected. So you're looking at here the 5 top exploits that hit the most fireboxes. One of the first high level things to notice is 4 of the 5 exploits or issues that were being attacked are Microsoft based. The top one is actually a Internet Explorer memory corruption vulnerability, so it has more to do with your web browser. This would be like the classic drive-by download type attacks where if your user goes to the wrong site, hasn't patched Internet Explorer, they might get popped. But what we find more interesting here are a number of very well-known marketing name exchange vulnerabilities. If you look at the second, the fourth, and fifth attack, they all represent very big vulnerabilities. The second is a proxy login. If you remember, this was a pretty critical vulnerability against Exchange servers that could allow remote users to execute code. Uh, I believe we've seen this in our top 10 all the way since about starting late 2022, all through last year, and it remains to be high. At this point, you should have patched proxy login long ago, but it shows you that when you have a very critical, ubiquitous, well-known vulnerability, attackers are going to add it to their libraries, their exploit kits, and even their botnets, and they'll continue to try to exploit it because apparently people still sometimes become late patching their servers or maybe expose old servers. But what's interesting too is between the fourth and fifth, those are 2 other name vulnerabilities you might have heard of: proxy shell and proxy not shell. So it's just very interesting to see our most widespread exploits. 3 of them are exchange flaws. They're very well-known named ones that were pretty serious in the industry. And even though they've been patched for quite a long time, bad guys continue to try to exploit them regularly. So definitely something to consider, and one of the reasons why you should for sure make sure you patch software quickly, as you all well know.
The last section of our internet security report that we go, or at least in the Firebox feed section, is entirely around malicious web domains. And we get this telemetry from the DNS Watch service that runs on Firebox appliances that have set it up. If you're not familiar with DNS Watch, it acts at, as you may guess, the DNS level. So when a client or a piece of malware or anything goes to connect to a attacker destination, it'll typically do so using a domain name like attacker.com. And under the hood, your computer has to resolve that domain name to a IP address, the actual location of the server, to open the connection. And so DNS Watch works by sticking itself right in the middle of that resolution, intercepting it, comparing it against our dozens of threat intelligence feeds, both internal and external. And if the connection would be going to a malicious destination, it instead redirects it or routes it to a safe, secure black hole instead, where the user then, the victim in this case, or would-be victim, can even get like a little bit of phishing awareness training there in the moment too. There's quite a few different categories that we can categorize these different domains as, but the 3 main ones that we look at are domains associated with malware or malware delivery or malware command and control, domains that were actually legitimate websites but have been compromised to host a malicious bit of content, and then phishing websites, which is pretty self-explanatory. And so in this last quarter, there were actually 6 different new entries to the malware domains. 4 of them, you'll see some very similar looking ones in the middle of the list, are all associated with a DNS tunneling campaign. If you're not familiar with DNS tunneling, it's a way to effectively exfiltrate data out of a endpoint in a way that's pretty sneaky for any protection services that might be looking for that data to be leaving your endpoint. It uses DNS requests in order to send data to a server under an attacker's control. Another one, this pixel-install domain in there, was associated with a malvertising campaign that tried to redirect users to both like graphic pornographic content, but also malware hosting domains as well. And then when we move on to the compromised websites, one new addition to the top compromised domains for the quarter was actually a Polish domain. It was found hosting a fake invoice phish. Actually, some time ago, I believe we added this to our feed back in like 2019, but we've still seen malicious content hosted on this otherwise legitimate website. When we go to the phishing domains, Almost all of them are returnees from previous quarters. There was only one brand new one, which was that SharePoint subdomain down at the bottom, where we found it hosting a DHL shipping notification fish. And this one is a common trend we've seen quarter after quarter of adversaries leveraging these otherwise good domains like SharePoint.com, where they can go and register their own subdomains and host content on them. And they use that to piggyback off the otherwise good reputation of SharePoint.com to then host malicious content. And this can really impact users that have been trained correctly to hover over a link in an email before clicking on it. And if they see, oh, it's a Microsoft owned domain, then it must be legitimate. But that's not good enough on its own anymore because attackers can leverage these cloud hosting services to really host whatever they want in this case. There was one question in here that I want to answer as well too, where someone asked, so what are the most recent reoccurring attacks we're seeing these days? Are man-in-the-middle attacks, or adversary in the middle, as you sometimes see them called too, where an attacker will send a phishing link to a victim. That link goes to a website under the attacker's control where they can sit in the middle of this connection between the victim and a otherwise legitimate service and steal credentials out of the middle there. And so the question was, what would be the best service to correctly prevent this type of attack? And DNS Watch is exactly one of those services because it can prevent your users from clicking on that malicious link in the first place and prevent them from going to that attacker in the middle infrastructure and instead route the connection to a secure black hole. So DNS Watch is one of the tools alongside WebBlocker and other reputation-based tools that can quite easily protect your users against that style of attack. So that was a good question. With that though, Corey, maybe we can continue on.
Absolutely. I was going to say, by the way, to the SharePoint ones, though, those legitimate domains that allow customers to obviously put up custom content, they are the scary ones to me. And I just usually I do still think hover over is useful, but I go up past the domain and look at the heading too. But that United Nations one in particular is just pretty darn nefarious because even that seems legit. I'm surprised that United Nations hasn't gone and tried to register a SharePoint and get that name back. But very scary stuff. So now that we covered most of the network stuff, why don't we go ahead and jump through the tips? And Mark, I will let you grab the first.
As soon as I can get myself off mute. And so one of the key trends that we've been talking about over the last half an hour or so is that signature-based anti-malware services do a great job of quickly catching the bulk of malware threats out there, the noise, but they aren't perfect. And it's relatively trivial for an adversary to create evasive malware variants that can get past some of these signature-based services. And that means you need to leverage machine learning, or again, because this is a PowerPoint presentation, AI based anti-malware tools like Intelligent AV or even APT Blocker with its behavior detections too. You need these levels of tools in order to pick up and catch what some of these signature-based protections miss. If you're a WatchGuard customer, that means total security, which includes these tools, really should be the standard for a Firebox appliance. Corey, you want to grab the next one?
Yeah, let me go. Sorry, we're monitoring your questions in between, so I have to get back to the presentation. The next one seems very obvious, but it's really avoid end-of-life software. And this also adds to because you want to be able to patch everything. As you heard in my IPS section, there were a lot of Microsoft exploits and products being targeted. We didn't talk about it in full detail, but even in other parts of the malware section, like widespread malware and TLS malware, we often see Office documents being becoming malware. And the reason they're useful as malware often is because of a vulnerability in a previous version of Office that might be used to trigger code execution or something. So you really need to avoid end of life software, because we're finding a lot of these vulnerabilities, even the exploits, are really targeting old things in software that Microsoft isn't even updating anymore because it's relatively old. There's patches for some of these vulnerabilities oftentimes, but you have to have the most recent version, or at least a relatively updated and not end of life version, in order to get the patches for things. So just remember these, for the people that are staying ahead of patches, the people that don't have Windows 2012 servers hanging out somewhere because they just haven't had a chance or the budget to update them, you're probably fine. You're probably patching and don't worry about it. But as we've talked to different customers and businesses, it seems pretty usual that for different types of business reasons, you always have that one network or place where you might be dealing with an old server that's end of life. And remember, that's exactly why many of the exploits we see being leveraged are old. It's cheap as heck for a malware actor to take an old exploit and continue spamming it to the internet whenever they see an open port. Sure, 99% of the time someone has an updated server, but they might be that one time where they find someone that has that end of life server that's been exposed. So make sure to avoid end of life software. And more importantly, the reason for that is make sure to patch while you're at it.
And then finally, one of the other big trends we saw from this quarter and previous quarters too were a lot of these malware variants and even some of the network attacks specifically target Linux-based servers as well, not just Windows machines. And while I think everyone these days understands the necessity of good endpoint protection, both traditional anti-malware and endpoint detection response on Windows machines, oftentimes Linux-based machines get overlooked. And with all the malware we're seeing targeting and specifically designed to go after these machines, really you can't be ignoring Linux servers either. And you need to make sure you're deploying protections that can protect these systems. The good news is, like with the Firebox sitting at the network perimeter, it doesn't care what the recipient operating system is going to be. It can detect all threats all the same. But we'll go into the endpoint section here in a little bit. And that's a great example of where you need a endpoint protection tool that can run on multiple systems.
Mark, just because we're talking defense tips, I noticed one question that came in. I unfortunately was looking at chat before I moved to questions. Was it is a defense tip, but it's a more specific Firebox defense tip. Someone asked if it's possible to configure a Firebox to do all three of our anti-malware services, GAV, IAV, and APT, on TLS traffic. The answer is yes, absolutely. And the person that asked, you obviously do know the right way. That the hardest part of that is going to be enabling TLS decryption, which the right way to do that is through the HTTPS proxy you've talked about. Once you have that HTTPS proxy, though, and you've set it up so you're either using your corporate certificate or have exported certificates to clients, once that's working, it should be trivial to turn on GAV, IAV, and APT blocker. It's just a matter of you going in that client policy and making the adjustment. It sounds like you said one of those
To
is disabled. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
to get a little in the weeds for their question, so the settings for these anti-malware services technically aren't on the HTTPS proxy action policy itself. When you turn on that decryption, there's a HTTP proxy action that will now take effect that you have to configure, and you'll set up these services and all the other HTTP-based protections within that kind of sub action that takes effect once it's decrypted. That's where you'll
Yeah.
find the settings.
Yep.
There was one other
Exactly.
question in here
Oh, go
that
ahead.
popped up where Corey, you mentioned that SSL is no longer safe, and TLS is preferred. The question was, WatchGuard has a mobile VPN with SSL, as we call it. Is it safe with SSL being obsolete? I'll say this one, it's more of a marketing slash product name issue versus a actual technology issue. The mobile VPN with SSL uses TLS 1.2 or 1.3 under the hood. Just haven't changed the name because
A
it's what
simpler
people
way
are
to
used
say
to.
this is I think the industry as a whole still kind of defaults to saying SSL because we've been saying it forever. So that's why the product name hasn't changed. But we in fact, Mark and our pre-cert team, including me, we actually are ones that help the product management team keep up with the latest encryption. So even though it's called SSL, it has a variant of TLS. I don't remember if it supports all the way up to 1.3 or 1.4. 1.4 hasn't even come out yet, but yeah, it does it. That said,
Cool.
let's go ahead and jump straight into endpoint, as Mark alluded. So this now comes from, as I mentioned before, WatchGuard DPDR and 8360 data. Let's start off again with what Mark likes to call the 20,000 feet view, which is, let's just talk about the amount of malware we saw during the quarter. More specifically, though, this isn't the raw number, which would probably be tens of millions, even for the small sample set of our report, or the tens of thousands of devices there, but would be huge amounts of numbers. Actually, this is endpoint, so it'd be millions of samples. But let's just talk about unique malware variants. So when we say unique malware variants, how many specific different malware samples by say hash or signature do we see? And you can see this number has been going down, but it's still just under 100,000. So during Q4 of 2023, we saw about 95,000, 95.5 thousand different unique malware variants. The more unique variants we see, it doesn't necessarily mean there's lots of new malware families, but it definitely suggests there's more polymorphic malware, there's more packing and encrypting going on, and there may be more malware families happening at the same time. But this number has been kind of dropping quarter over quarter. You can see it rose a little bit last quarter, or the quarter before Q4, Q3, but it did drop a little bit now. With that said, though, we are seeing widespread malware change a little. So let's go ahead and let Mark cover that part.
Yeah. One of the other things we track is for any given attack or variant that we see, how many individual machines did that thing get triggered on? So, for example, did only a single person in a single organization see this malware variant, or did it impact dozens of machines or hundreds around the world or in that company? And one of the trends that we've had for the past couple of quarters is malware is becoming more widespread, meaning we're seeing a shift away, a decrease in malware variants that only impact a single host, and increases in malware variants that impact multiple hosts. And in this case, it's an increase in ones that impact 2 to 5 machines, so still a small number, but more than just a single variant. And this is a continuation of a trend that we've seen over the past couple of months as well. And it kind of makes sense if you've got a malware variant that works. In this case, we're detecting and blocking it, so it doesn't. But maybe it works on machines that are have a less than stellar anti-malware protection agent running on it. If it works, you want to get the most bang for your buck on that and deliver it to as many hosts as you can. And you can see your success rate going up versus spending some of that time and investment on making that really sophisticated one-off malware variant going after individual machines. Corey, anything you want to add or continue trucking on?
No, that's a good one. It is very interesting to look at widespread. But the next thing we should talk about for endpoint that I always find interesting is the top attack vector. Ultimately, the different types of malware are interesting, but as a defender, you really want to know, how is the malware getting on my user machines? Is it a user mistake? If it is a mistake, where is it happening? Is it happening from an email, a link they're clicking, something they're doing? Or technically, what parts of the machine is it targeting? So one of the sections of our report talks about attack vectors. And if you look at the far left of this chart, you can see some options are, for instance, scripts. Something like JavaScript, PowerShell scripts, Visual Basic, all stuff you might encounter on a web page or as an attachment in an email as a script. That script might trigger processes, especially if with the right user privilege, to do things that to add malware to your machine. It could be one of the things I mentioned that we see in network level 2, which is Office documents. Office documents, even by themselves, if they have links in them, although there's lots of protections to warn your users against going to those links, or more specifically, if they have macros in them, could offer opportunities to launch malware. Or if Office itself, if Word, PowerPoint, Excel, etc., have some sort of software vulnerability, that's another great way to introduce a malware. Previously, I mentioned something called the drive-by download. browsers. Anytime you're browsing the internet, if there's vulnerabilities in your browser, an extension, all kinds of frameworks that might be attached to your browser, that might be another great way to introduce malware. Acrobat, most people are most familiar with Adobe Reader. That basically means PDF files, just like Office documents, can have vulnerabilities. And finally, Windows binaries. There's a lot of malware that leverage that either try to fake some sort of well-known Windows binary, Windows file, or use living off the land techniques. Use something about the Windows subsystems to launch malware. So this really is trying to show you what is the most common way that malware arrives. And if you check our report, we have a nice pie graph that makes this a little more visual. But at the end of the day, you can see in Q4, scripts by far, at 77%, is the most popular way malware gets to a endpoint computer. And of that script, 90%ish, we occasionally make sure to say how much of it was PowerShell, but 90%ish of it is PowerShell. It's PowerShell somehow running. Maybe someone got an email with a .ps1 link. Now, if you ever get an email like that, who sends PowerShell scripts as file attachments in email? You really shouldn't run it, but that's one way PowerShell can load. It could be attached to a vulnerability. Someone might exploit a remote code execution vulnerability, and what they do with it is use command to run a PowerShell script. But scripts and PowerShell specifically are the most common root vector for malware to land on your laptop or computer. We believe part of the reason for this is because something called living off the land techniques are becoming very, very popular. Threat actors know that if they can use tools that exist on your computer, the longer they can use them, they can either never actually drop a malware file on your computer, or they can at least use the living off the land techniques to disable security or stage the rest of their payload in a way that it will evade detection. One interesting thing we've seen over the past 2 or 3 quarters, though, it used to be scripts accounted for even more of the attack vector, really up to 90%. But over the last few quarters, Windows files have been, I think it's around in the 30%. So it used to be Windows files did not account for much of the attack vector, similar to all the other ones you see on this list. But they have, I think it was in Q2 or Q3, it increased a lot. Windows files went down a little this quarter, bringing scripts back up. But the fact that we've seen so many Windows files be leveraged to launch malware on systems is something that's only happened over the past 2 or 3 quarters. And I do think that might also be somewhat attributed to living off the land techniques, just because they're often using Windows binaries to launch that. So that's the endpoint section. I think before we end today, let's jump right into the final protection tips, and then we can actually get some questions. Before I dive into the final protection tips, I do want to answer one question I saw, which was a simple one. Someone was asking a video of, do you have a video showing how to set up TLS decryption or SSL decryption? And Marc talked a little bit about it with the HTTPS proxy when we were talking, answering the other person's question. I am not aware of a video. That's an excellent question. I will definitely say, though, oh, we do have a video? Well, you should give the video. I was going to say Marc and I talk about it a lot in the 443 podcast, and there have been a couple podcasts where, at least audio-wise, we go through some of the setup. But go ahead with the video, Marc.
I'll post a link in the chat. I think I can. But if you go to the WatchGuard Technologies YouTube channel, we've got a demo video for TLS decryption, which walks through some of the setup in there. And we also have I think, entire playlist of training content developed by one of our training members here at WatchGuard. And there's a few different tutorials on how to set up deep inspection, how to create an Active Directory certificate for content inspection, and how to get it all configured on the Firebox. So again, if you go to the WatchGuard Technologies YouTube channel, there's a bunch of different training videos, and some of them are for some of these more complex technical topics, like setting up deep packet inspection. I'll post one link here in chat, which I believe everyone should be able to see to get you started. And through that playlist, through the channel, you should be able to find the other ones as well.
Does it cover the? I will say, in the past, long time ago, when people first started doing TLS decryption, the most common way is the hardest part of it is making sure the certificate either all of your clients have or that the firebox has. uh, the CA certificate, the certificate that allows you to intercept the traffic, is set up. And in the past, the way that long time ago you did this is you would take the certificate off the network security device, in this case, the firebox, and then you'd have to find a way to import it to all the clients. And of course, there's many different clients you might have to do it to, and IoT devices may not have ways to import. So that used to make TLS decryption very hard. But the other way to do this now is take your own domain CA certificate. One, like if you have Active Directory, you probably have a CA certificate already, and import to that firebox. And that method is the much easier of the two ways, less time consuming to set this up, and will catch more use cases. So hopefully the videos Marc referred to covers those methods, preferably the second one in more detail. But that is one tip I've found. That said, getting to the report tips, final protection advice from this. We're talking about both network and endpoint attacks, and I actually think you really need to concentrate on having both protections. Like, some people think, you have all this anti-malware on the network, why do I need so much on the endpoint? Well, one, remote work. Some of your users probably aren't behind a physical firewall. But the other is, these defenses really work together. One of the things we've seen over many reports is there's some quarters where network is catching way more malware and endpoint detections are down. Like this quarter. This quarter, network-based detections went up, but endpoint-based detections dropped. Meanwhile, we've seen just the opposite before. Suddenly the network's not catching much and the endpoint is up. How do you explain this? Well, one, if your endpoints are behind network, that could explain why network's catching a lot and saving the endpoint from having to detect it. But I really think it's because evasive malware can target both types of services. Most malware will start as a stager, and that's what networks are catching. They don't see the final payload because the bad guy first has to get a stager, a downloader, some sort of Trojan down on that endpoint. And the network can often catch that. But maybe they figure out evasion techniques. For instance, if maybe they have to use an exploit to get past your network defenses, and you have intrusion prevention, which might catch that exploit, maybe they find a new 0-day, or they find a way to get past one of the defenses to get past your network onto the endpoint, which is why you need those endpoint protections too. That said, they're also trying to evade the endpoint. You think the endpoint is where that malware happens, so that's the best place for defense? That's not always the case. Because of living off the land attacks, there's lots of ways that threat actors can evade different endpoint defenses, can even actually go and disable defenses before loading their real stage. Now, I will say, by the way, advanced products like EPDR, some of that EDR, endpoint detection and response capability, it's designed to catch the techniques associated with these living off the land attacks. So it will catch indicators of attack, it will catch process injection, and it will catch some fancy things that avoid that sort of evasion, but nothing is ever perfect. So the main point is, I think it's really good to have both. Because bad guys are trying to evade both, having both gives you the highest return on investment for actually catching most of the evasion out there. Marc?
And for the second one, don't have a whole lot more to add other than what we've already covered, in that when it comes to these protections, you don't want to rely just on that first layer of defense, and you need those multiple layers like Corey just mentioned. And when it comes to those layers, you want to make sure you're leveraging modern anti-malware tools that don't rely on human developed signatures to try and catch malicious content, and instead can be proactive and predictive when it comes to catching these threats. We call them machine learning based tools. You'll see marketing content call them artificial intelligence now, thanks to ChatGPT. But the reality is, these tools do a great job of taking in the millions of training samples that we give them and constantly retrain them on, and using that wealth of knowledge to spot little minor things that humans might not even notice if they were manually analyzing a file, and predict whether it's going to be malicious or bad with very strong certainty. So definitely leverage these more advanced tools in your defensive stack for your organization.
And the last tip is kind of the partner to the first tip we had for the Firebox feed. You know, before I talked about end of life software, there's a one of the reasons I talked about it, that is a few of the threats we didn't actually talk about, but are in our report. We're targeting things like ATutor and Quagga, which is end of life software. Like ATutor and certain versions of Quagga aren't being supported, aren't getting updates, and yet threat actors are targeting vulnerabilities in them. And when you use tools like Shodan to see what's out there, those products are still out there. On top of that, what I said about proxy login, proxy shell, and proxy not shell, all of these are well-known vulnerabilities. If you are even a little on the game as far as paying attention to vulnerability assessment and doing patches when you shouldn't even have to think about these vulnerabilities anymore, because some of them didn't surface in the wild. They surfaced way back in 2020, so they should be gone. And yet again, if we do those Shodan searches, we find lots of people out there. So to me, this is like the old joke that you don't have to be faster than the bear. You have to just be faster than all your friends that are running from the bear. So for goodness sake, don't be the last to patch or to update that end of life old software. You know, at least be faster than the rest of the world that apparently isn't patching, and get those patched before these old vulnerabilities haunt you. It seems silly sometimes that some of the most common vulnerabilities we see being exploited are really kind of old updates, but there's a reason for it. It's because attackers can just spam out an existing exploit over and over, and there's still a lot of folks that aren't keeping things up to date. So make sure to do that. With that said, I want to jump in to see if we can spend a little extra time, even though we're over, for
Yeah.
people that want to stay, to see if there's any questions. But check us out on our 443 Security Simplified podcast. But with that, anything to stay question wise, Mark? I haven't looked
There's a
for a bit.
couple real quick. So there was one that was asking about a way to programmatically expose our data that we use for the report. That's a great idea, and something that we'll take into consideration and see what we might be able to do. We're always looking for new ways to display this data, including trying to find a way to bring it into WatchGuard Cloud as well for you to view it in there too. So we'll take that into consideration and see what we can do. There was another question about TLS deep inspection on smaller tabletop appliances and whether there would be a performance impact on, say, like a T25, like an older, very small device. There is a performance impact, but it is typically negligible on most of our devices. We include specific like ASICs chips in order to handle and offload most of this TLS decryption for traffic going through it. I won't say it's a zero performance impact, but it is something that we actually tend to excel in, at least in the industry, at handling that to be able to do the inspection.
I will add to that one, Mark, because the same audience member also mentioned specifically they have 5 users, and to me that is the key. If you look at our data sheets, we have things like user recommendations. Those are designed with features like TLS in mind. Yes, there is obviously anytime you have to decrypt and re-encrypt. By the way, we do re-encrypt the traffic on the other side. There's technically performance and resource used, but the product management does a good job of making sure between the acceleration Mark talked about, kind of placing our appliances at a place where they can support this very quickly. And the fact that you have 5 users only in the office with the T25, I feel like it should handle it it should handle it fine. If you made a T25 support 50 users or 100 users, that might be a problem though. But as long as you're looking at our performance metrics and user metrics for the devices you're getting, is if you're using those within reason, it's typically pretty good.
And the last one was a question around authentication and TLS to reduce zero-day malware attacks or successful ones. And I want to just quickly clarify what we mean about TLS and zero-day malware in this case. When we're talking about that combination, it's evasive malware that's being delivered over a encrypted web connection that typically uses TLS to do that. It's easy and free for anyone to go and encrypt their website or their web server using tools like Let's Encrypt. which allows attackers to hide within that encrypted connection from anti-malware services that aren't trying to break into and inspect that connection. And so this is where intentionally man in the middling that connection with your network security appliance, like the firebox in this case, can help you crack open that connection within the confines of the firebox, inspect it, act on it, block anything that's malicious, and then re-encrypt it before delivering it to the endpoint. And that is the combination you need in order to protect against these evasive threats that are leveraging really just basic encryption technologies available for websites these days. I hope that answered the question. But I think that's it for there.
Yeah.
So thank you
Yeah.
everyone
Thank
for
you all.
attending.
And thanks for staying late for the folks that wanted to hear the questions. Pleasure. Have a great day.